humble state trooper, courageously holding back the tides of chaos against all odds isn't just the backbone of the Empire, it's one of the most iconic images in Warhammer fantasy history. In this video, I'm going to paint a handgunner in the classic white and red scheme of Talabheim. I had a lot of fun painting this model, and it brought back a shed load of hobby nostalgia for me of playing 6th edition fantasy. I really hope you enjoy it. We're going to begin with the uniform itself. You can see I've already put sand on the base and base coated the model with wraithbone. For the white, our first step is to shade the area with skeleton horde. I've mixed this with equal parts Larmian medium, because straight out of the bottle the contrast is a bit too strong. I'm doing a quartered scheme for this model, so I'm going to end the contrast paint here on this leg at the centre of the torso, as neatly as I can, before moving on to the opposite arm. You can of course mix and match the colour placement across models for variation. So, just work your way around carefully, coating one area completely before moving on to the next, soaking up any excess pooling as you go along, and redistributing that across the model. With that dry, it's left some great shading. Our next step is to re-establish the wraithbone base. I'm going to dilute it to a glaze consistency, and gently push that over the flat areas, working towards where the light would hit to leave a smooth highlight and re-establish some lighter colour. You can see the same principle here on the leg, just gently layering the diluted paint back over these flatter areas, thinking about where it would be brightest. With some undiluted wraithbone, we can also start applying some thicker edge highlights to any of the sharper areas or ruffles in the cloth. Next, we're going to accentuate the highlights even further with Pallid witch flesh. We'll begin in a very similar way, thinning the paint to a glaze consistency and continuing to highlight the rounder and flatter areas of the cloth, covering a smaller area. This will provide a nice smooth transition from one colour to the other. We're also going to edge highlight the sharper areas and creases, making the highlights slightly thinner this time to leave some of the previous stage visible. Finally, with white scar, spot highlight the very sharpest or most prominent points and folds in the cloth. Use this sparingly, we want the overall effect of the colour to be a warm off-white rather than stark cold white, but just accentuate anywhere you want the eye to be most drawn. And with that done, you have a really spectacular white cloth. We can now move on to the red. For a really rich base coat, we're going to begin with Khorne red. Even over wraithbone, you may need more than one coat for an even finish. Just thin the paint down and wait for the first coat to dry before applying a second. And it goes without saying, being very careful not to get it over any of the white you just finished. Next, to shade that down, apply Carroburg crimson all over the red. Next, re-establish the base colour by reapplying Khorne red over the flatter areas, leaving the deepest recesses shaded. We can now start to build up a smooth gradient across the red, in a similar way as for the white cloth. Begin with a 50-50 mix of Khorne red and Evil Sunz scarlet, thinning it to a glaze consistency and starting to layer across the flatter areas, again working upwards towards the light source. Work your way around the model, beginning to establish this colour everywhere you think it needs it. Next, do exactly the same thing with pure Evil Sunz scarlet, covering a slightly smaller area with the glazing, and edge highlighting the fabric folds. Then, with a 50-50 mix of Evil Sunz scarlet and Trollslayer orange, establish the highest points in the cloth with edge highlights. And finally, with pure Trollslayer orange, spot highlight the extreme edges in exactly the same way as we did with white scar earlier. And with that done, the iconic Talabheim uniform is complete, as is the majority of the model. We can now turn to the leather areas, which we'll be painting in two colours. For the vests, we're going to begin by base coating these with Rhinox hide. You may again need more than one coat for a smooth finish. We're also going to base coat any leather caps in Rhinox hide too. With Dryad bark, base coat the hat. We're also going to use Dryad bark to base coat the belts, the shoes, and finally the wood of the handgun. With Wildwood contrast paint, we're now going to shade all of the areas we just painted with Dryad bark to darken them down. Be very careful here, this paint is dark and will stain the white cloth, so make sure not to get it over anywhere you've already painted. For the vests and caps, we're going to create a mixture of 3 parts Rhinox hide to 1 part Skrag brown, thin it to a glaze consistency, and begin to build up a transition towards the top of these areas, exactly like we did for the cloth. We're going to cover maybe the top 2/3 here. Then, do exactly the same thing, but this time with an equal mix of both paints, covering a smaller area, maybe just half. With pure Skrag brown, we're going to edge highlight these areas. You can also use Skrag brown to paint some scratches and dots on the leather to simulate wear and use. And finally, with a 50-50 mix of Skrag brown and Averland sunset, spot highlight the most prominent areas. For the other brown areas, with a mixture of equal parts Dryad bark and Baneblade brown, put some thick edge highlights on the belt. We can also use this to begin to re-establish colour on the shoes, leaving the shade in the recesses. For the hat, thin this to a glaze consistency and start to build up highlights on the flatter top. Push the paint towards the bottom of the hat where light would fall more. You can build up a few layers of this to build up the colour. We can finally use this mixture to start painting some stripes on the gun handle to simulate wood grain. Next, with pure Baneblade brown, we're going to highlight all of these areas further, with thinner edge highlights covering less area to leave some of the previous layer visible. For the hat, glaze it and continue to build up that transition. We can also use this to start painting some weathering with dots and scratches as for the leather, and begin to build up an edge highlight. Finally, paint some thinner lines within the previous to continue building up the wood grain. Next, with a 50-50 mix of Baneblade brown and Rakarth flesh, continue working around all of these areas. For the hat, use this to highlight the sharper edges and folds, and also to accentuate the scratches and weathering if you want. Pick out the edges of the shoes, and highlight the wood grain with even finer lines. And finally, with pure Rakarth flesh, just spot highlight the extreme points on the shoes and the hat. Now onto some smaller details. Cover the powder flasks and horn with Aggaros dunes, diluted with equal part contrast medium. Don't forget the ones tucked away on the front of the model. Shade the feathers with skeleton horde. Highlight the powder flasks with wraithbone. Then dot highlight with white scar. We can also use white scar to dry brush the feather. As an optional detail, take some wildwood contrast and paint some stripes on the feather for added variation. Don't forget to paint the back as well, matching where the stripes would be on the front. For any bags, base coat them with Warboss green. Then, shade with Militarum green contrast. Highlight back up with Warboss green. Then spot highlight by adding in 50% wraithbone. Moving our attention to the gun, base coat the barrel and any other iron areas with lead belcher. Pick out the firing mechanism with Hashut copper. Shade all of the iron areas with Nuln oil. Shade the copper areas with Carroburg crimson. Edge highlight the silver with Stormhost silver. Highlight the mechanism with Liberator gold. And then spot highlight this with Stormhost silver also. And there we are, almost finished, just the skin to go. Begin by base coating all of the flesh areas with Night Questor flesh. Then, wash Reikland fleshshade all over. Re-establish the base colour with Night Questor flesh, leaving the Reikland shade in the recesses. Next, add in some Flayed one flesh to the Night Questor flesh, till it's about a 25-75 mix. We're going to use this to start establishing the shape of the face, defining the features, and establishing where we're going to want to build highlights over the next steps. Now add more Flayed one flesh till it's a 50-50 mix, and build up these highlights, further defining the face. You can see here, for example, I've picked out the top of the cheeks and the chin, leaving a slightly more shaded area on the cheekbones. With pure Flayed one flesh, continue the process, beginning to focus only on the more prominent points of the face. We can also use this to begin to define the hand, picking out the individual finger tendons. With a 50-50 mix of Flayed One Flesh and Screaming Skull, accentuate those prominent points even further, using this to define the bridge and tip of the nose, the top lip, cheekbones, etc. And finally, with pure Screaming Skull, spot highlight the most extreme points. Be very sparing with this. We can also use it to pick out the knuckles and fingertips on the hands. And with that, the skin is complete. Painting the lower lip is a good way to make faces feel more real. Base coat it with a 50-50 mix of Gal Vorbak Red and Night Questor Flesh, then add in some Wraithbone to highlight it. We could leave the model here, but I want to add some stubble to make the face more interesting. This couldn't be easier, and actually the secret to Gud's stubble is green. Heavily thin down some Coelia greenshade, wipe most off your brush, and glaze it over where you want the stubble to be, working downwards. The effect seems really subtle at first, but as it dries it leaves a great 5 o'clock shadow impression. Let the glaze dry completely, and then apply a second layer. You can do as many as you want to build up a stronger colour, but don't go overboard or the green will come through too heavily. I tend to do 2 to 3 layers. But you can see how amazing that looks. All that's left to do is to base your model, and you're finished. And there we are, State Troopers straight out of a 6th edition fantasy book. Although I've demonstrated these techniques on a handgunner, they're of course applicable to any other type of State Trooper or Empire model. I might turn this video into a series looking at different state uniforms in turn. I've painted up a couple here to show you how they look en masse. As always, please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, it really helps, and let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see me paint next. In any case, I'll see you next time, and until then, happy painting.